at the University of Nebraska. And when they went to return that, as they were culling out the collection, the library, which was then taken care of by Fitzpatrick's son, he said, no, I'll tell you what, there's still a copy of that book in the library here, so the University of Nebraska can keep that copy. And they still have it. And if you look in the card catalog, you'll see it is ex-library Thomas Jefferson and Fitzpatrick. I have no idea. There were 12 copies of that book. Fitzpatrick owned 2 of them, one which stayed in his collection and one which he gave the University of Nebraska. I have been unable to put a price on it. One hasn't gone up for auction in even recent history. Second edition is worth about $12,000. Both of these were first editions, so I have no idea. Yes. As people dealt with Fitzpatrick all over the world, book dealers, they all thought they were dealing with a multi-millionaire. They just assumed, because if he wanted a book, he would say, how much is it? And he would buy it. Haggle, he just took it. As I talked to Frances Glenn's wife, artist, which kind of interestingly I met when she came back to Lincoln to buy another library, Johnny Johnson's library. And I got to interview her. And I said, you know, this must have been really something interesting to work with. When you think of all the books that he had, that obviously he couldn't have read, he couldn't have known what he had, it's kind of sad to think that he just kept collecting. And she said, well, now wait a minute. She said, now you know that we only took a small percentage of the books. But as we did, we vetted them. As I said, they had to look and see if all the plates were there and so forth. She said, every single book we bought, in the front, on the title page, in lead pencil, there was an annotation made. First of all, if the book was complete, all the pages were there, it would say complete, TJX, this column. It would then say how much he paid for the book, where he bought it, how much postage was on the package, and what that book was going for sale at other places. She said every single book. Also back then, there was no such thing as spell check. And when a book came out, they were loaded with errors. And you've seen people, maybe in your memory, that would see an error like in Time magazine. The word "the" would be spelled T-E-H, and they would correct it over the margin. She said every single book had corrections all the way through. Every single book that we bought. And she said, we're not talking about, you know, 10,000 or 20,000 bucks. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of books. I said, well, how is that possible? It seems to me that evidently it must have been. We know that his wife was helping him because she was helping him. He had a son and a daughter. Maybe they were helping him. We actually found the lady who helped them put together the herbarium. All of her name slips my mind. She went to First Home Congregational Church, and I met her. I've got it written down someplace. She was hired by the WPA to go out and help him put together the herbarium. And she tells a story about how it was put together. I talked to Professor Stout the first time, and I told him what I knew, and I said, now tell me some stories. And he said, well, let me tell you about the first time I met Fitzy. So I called her Teddy, people downtown called him Fitzy. Okay? So I said, when I first met Fitzy, is at the University Library when he was the librarian for the biology department. And he said what he had done was he had sent memos to everybody in all the disciplines all across the university system and said, if you have duplicates, send them over to me. And then I will use them to trade to build up the biology and botany library. So that's how he built it without any university money going into it. He got all these people to give him all these books, and he would trade them. Constantly trade them. So he said, I had a student who was working on his doctoral thesis. And he said he needed a book. And he told me what it was, but I don't remember. And it was something like U.S. Pharmacopoeia, GPO publication, but they didn't have it in the regular library catalog. So he said, I went down to the library with the student to see if there was a copy in his library at home. And he said, the library, the biology department was just like you think it was. It was shambles. He said, but he knew where every single thing was. He said, for example, there was a stack of GovDocs, government documents, you know, pamphlets from the Department of Agriculture, He said you could ask him for volume 17, number 31 of the U.S. Department of Agriculture bulletin on grub worms, and he'd just go, Pull it out. He knew where it was. He said, so we went down and we asked him about this particular book. And he said, yeah. He said, I do have a copy of that. I said, yeah. Just a minute. He said, I bought it from Howell's Book Company in San Francisco, 1922, for $20. He says, you come out to the house tonight and I'll loan it to your student. Stout says, I went out to the house. He said, first of all, let me tell you, you're wrong. That's not how the house looked. This is the 1920s. He said, it didn't look like it ever been painted, and I did have to go through the kitchen door. He said, but it wasn't loaded up with junk and stuff. He said, the first thing that impressed me was that the door was held closed by a 10-penny nail that you just turned out of the way. He said, and I went into the kitchen, and it wasn't like you said it was. It was just a proper, clean kitchen at that time. Remember, this is 30-some years previous. And he said, he went over to the breakfast room. And he said, there were no cots. Okay, it was a breakfast. He said, but there was a shelf up around the top. And on it was a row of scribble books, which didn't mean anything to me. But I found out by pressing him that those were Big Chief tablets. Remember, they used to cost a nickel and they were on newsprint, remember? He said this was his indexing system. He said he went over and he ran his fingers down, he found one, pulled it on, flipped through it. He said, here it is. Here it is. It says, Howell's Book Company, 1922, $30. He'd forgotten how much he paid for it. He said, wait here, I'll go up and get it. He said, I wasn't out in the rest of the house. No, it was. He said, stuck it back up. He went off. I was talking to Mary. A while later, he came down with the book. I took the book away with me, loaned it to the student. The student wrote a dissertation. And at that time, if he had not been able to get that book, the student would have had two choices. He could have gone to Washington, D.C. to the Library of Congress, where the other known copy was, and he could have worked with it. Or he could have hired an amanuensis, which was perfectly legal, somebody to go and do the research for him. So this was a pretty good deal for the student. He said, I took the book back to Fitzy in the library and never thought about it again. I was never in the house again until after he was dead. He says, and at that time, I went with Lloyd Chapman. The books were all out of the house. The house was empty. And he said, I went out because I knew about that printing press up on the second floor, and I wanted it for the biology department. He said, I wanted to print labels for the herbarium. He said, so I went out, and Chapman said, if you want it, you can have it for $37. That's the value of the scrap metal. But you have to move it. And it was one of those that had a great big flywheel on the side. It must have weighed about like a 57 Buick. It was on the second floor of the house. So they had to hire Sullivan's Moving, come in and get this press and take it out. He says, there I am with him talking about the state. He said, I asked Chapman, this must have been just phenomenal work about this. He said, Chapman admitted he didn't have a clue. He never understood it, never had a clue. And it's obvious. He didn't have any idea what he was working with from any point of view. Well, here are all these books with all these little notations in them. So I said to Mrs. Glenn, just think of it. He, his wife, his two kids, and whoever else they could get from the WP area, they spent literally every waking hour, apparently, looking at these books, writing in the margins, correcting them. So it just flabbergasting. How could he even slept, let alone have two children?